All right. We'll recommence. I think we've a particularly interesting afternoon ahead of us, but we're going to start with feeding back to you the discussions or the nature of the discussions that took place before lunch, and David is going to do that.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So I have 4 slides to present you. The first slide is already up there on changes to how the Dáil operates. These are the points that were coming back from all of you from the 2 morning sessions. And in red are the points where a lot of tables made the same point. So we put those in red just to show that there's a lot of consensus on some of these points. So there seems to be a strong view that the Ceann Comhairle should be elected by secret ballot. And then a couple of sub-points underneath that one coming from some tables. Perhaps the nomination of the Ceann Comhairle should be across party lines. There was a question raised by one table whether the Ceann Comhairle should even be a member of the Dáil. And then a point raised by another table that the Ceann Comhairle position should be rotated every year. I think the idea was it might be rotated across party lines every year. But there's some suggestions, but the main one there is the election of the Ceann Comhairle by secret ballot. Then another very strong view that the guillotine should be used a lot less. And even a suggestion by one table that the Ceann Comhairle might have a role in deciding when the guillotine could apply. Loosen whip on private members' motions. Included also by one table the idea that there should be more use of the right of voting on matters of conscience, to have a free vote on matters of conscience. So a signal there being given about loosening the whip generally. Independent legal advice for backbenchers, independent from government. That was a point that was raised a bit this morning, I heard. And better resources generally for the opposition. Then the second slide is still on the Dáil, that the final 2 slides are on other themes. So this is a continuation of the previous slide. A new Dáil Reform Committee, not a subcommittee. This was a point made by at least one table, with suggestions that perhaps 2/3 of the members should be from the opposition parties. And in addition, one table suggested there might be this additional external committee that was also raised a bit this morning. So a big focus on some kind of Dáil Reform Committee process, whether internally or externally, is what's been suggested in that bullet point. More family-friendly hours, better distribution of workload during the legislative year, which might also address the guillotine kind of point that came up already. The seating plan more like the Netherlands. A couple of points about seating plans. You'll remember one of Jane's slides was about how the Dáil seating plan is more like the House of Commons than it is like the Dutch system, which is more rounded. And one table said that we should get rid of the Dáil bar, but that was one table. Any changes to committees? So quite separate from the Dáil as a whole, what about the committees? There's 2 really strong points that came out from a lot of the tables. More resources for the committees, and combined with that, make spending of those resources more transparent. Because it's one thing to give a committee more resources, as we've heard. It's quite another thing to see that those resources are used. So that sort of linking the 2 points. The election of the committee chairs, that came out very powerfully. And then underneath that, as sort of sub-ideas, there might be a point that you elect the committee chairs, but how do you decide which parties control which committees before you elect the chairs of the committees? So do you use some kind of proportional formula like the Hunt to allocate committees across parties? Or do you use something like a 50-50 rule, opposition versus government parties? So various ideas there, but ultimately that the committee chairs should be elected. Allocate committee positions, quite apart from the chairs, but the actual positions on the committees. Allocate those on the basis of expertise, or at least have the idea that not everyone should be on a committee. No whip at committee stage, so that goes back to the point earlier on about the relaxation of the whip system generally. Introduce a committee week. You heard how in some parliaments committees all meet at 1 week, and that way there's no clashing between committee meetings and the Dáil meetings as a whole. Enforce attendance at committees, compel engagement by members on committees. Access to legal opinion and independent drafting resources for committees. That was relating again to independent legal advice for the Dáil. Adopting a liaison committee of chairs of committees, as they have in the United Kingdom. According to Jerry Buttimer, we have it, so that point, whatever table wanted it, has already been dealt with by the government. Link MEPs to EU Scrutiny Committee. So that I know MEPs have recently been given the right to come to committees. I know that's a recent reform. So how do you call the committee again formally?
No EU Scrutiny Committee anymore. Every committee is responsible for
Okay. Okay. Right, so a table with suggestion anyway that they would have linkage, so it sounds like they already have it.
Each committee has a policy club, and we must do the business in private first, then in public. And if there's a certain number of times a year, you have to do it.
Okay. Okay, so it sounds like that's a theme that's already addressed. And then finally, other ideas that just came up from various of the forums. The culture needs to change as much as the procedure. There should be greater accountability for civil servants, accountability to the Dáil for civil servants. Government should publish their legal advice. And finally, the policy process should be made more transparent. So those who are involved in the policy process, whether it's civil servants, lobbyists or whatever, there should be greater transparency in all of that process. So they're the main slides.
Okay. Thank you, David, for that. I mean, one thing that does strike me here is that a number of the ideas that are being suggested from certain tables are actually there already. And, you know, I think that needs to be acknowledged, where things are in place and where reform has been introduced already. We certainly, I think the convention would be reduced in credibility if we were recommending things that were already there. So I just make that comment, having listened to David's presentation and the response from the floor. Any comments? We have a bit of time. I'm going to take people who haven't spoken. Thomas Byrne first.
Sorry. I think a lot of the issues that have been raised are really important issues, and for example, electing the County Quarter by secret ballot, I really support. But my concern about the proceedings today is that many of these issues are directed almost from the excellent contributions of the speakers, and that the issue is so wide that there are so many other issues that I wonder, have we really got time to deal with them over the 2 days? It's such a massive issue. And so that's the only concern I have, notwithstanding that there are really important issues, and I would put election of the County Quarter by secret ballot at the top of the list myself. But there's so much else I think that we really could be discussing. The second point is, Tom, I mean, if you could refer to the matters that have already been reformed, I mean, I haven't seen that many of them, I have to say, listening to David's speech, that are already done. We would take issue with some of them if they're claimed as reforms, but there's a huge, as has been seen, I think, from the massive increase in the guillotine in the last couple of years, I think that there's a huge role for reform and a huge appetite for reform, I think, as well.
Okay. All I'm saying is that if things have happened or are, you know, they're really, this convention has to be aware of that and not be making recommendations for things that are already there. That's all I'm saying. Ivana was the next person I saw.
Thanks very much, Chair. Ivana Bacik. Just to say that our table had agreed with many of the points made there, but we had in particular the idea that both the roles of the Ceann Comhairle and the committees should be given constitutional status, really to strengthen them and to assist in changing the culture so that people could see the importance and the independence of those bodies. We also felt that in terms of trying to achieve greater accountability of elected representatives to the people, that it would be a good idea to have a State of the Union address, the equivalent of the Queen's speech, although obviously we wouldn't call it that, at the start of every year, where the government would set out its legislative programme and that would be debated publicly with leaders of the opposition. We also felt the committee week was hugely important, that would give, again, a greater status to committees, but that, you know, and that would give, I think, a greater sense of the work that committees do. And I mean, as you've just said, there is a lot of work that committees already do that just isn't realised. This idea, as others have said, that the sectoral committees carry out EU scrutiny on their own areas. So on the Justice Committee, which I'm a member of, we carry out scrutiny of justice and home affairs EU measures. We have an EU policy clerk. We did a few weeks ago a reasoned opinion where we objected to the proposal for the European Public Prosecutor. You know, a lot of stuff doesn't get reported, but it's really important work that we're doing on EU scrutiny currently. And we do currently also, and it's quite a new development, we have a number of independent lawyers, barristers, contracted to the Houses of the Oireachtas to provide independent legal advice to backbenchers in drafting private members' bills. And I think the issue of private members' bills, you know, again, that's an area where perhaps the whip system could be weakened, you know, even where the whip is important, of us defend it, particularly on government business, but on private members' bills, private members' motions, where we're seeing increasing, with this government, much more bringing forward of private members' business. And that's a really important part of the business of the Houses that should be strengthened.
Okay, thank you. Sorka.
Sorka O'Neill. I'm just wondering about what are actual constitutional issues, if we could maybe just narrow the remit down of all the points that were made, so we could stay on focus on those things, and then just the other points be put forward in the report at a later stage.
I think that's an important distinction, actually, yeah. Did I see another offering? 18. 18. Where is 18 first? 18, yeah.
18 Hayden. Could I just say, just a number of very quick points. One of the things that came up kind of consistently, I think, was the whole issue of government getting legal advice, which they were basically saying, we have legal advice that says this shouldn't be considered, that shouldn't be considered. If government are ever relying on legal advice that they get, I think that has to be published. And therefore it can be contradicted. But one of the points that Ivana made I thought was quite interesting, and that's relating to giving constitutional status to the committees. I think one of the important points of that is it's a bit like a director of a company. Irrespective of who nominates you to a company, a directorship, your duty of care is to the company. And I think something similar would be quite interesting in relation to committees. In other words, the committee member would have a duty of care to the business of the committee, which would supersede the party loyalty element. And I think that would definitely change the focus and function of committees in terms of their independence.
Okay, thank you. Keith?
Keith Burke. Just a term came up in our round tables this morning, and I'd just like a bit of a clarification. Sorry, is it on? Yeah. Speaking rights and how it relates to independence. If we could just have maybe a minute or two explanation on that. Because my interpretation of what was discussed is independents don't really have any.
Yeah. Greatest living expert will answer this.
That's right. No pressure there then, Chairman. Yeah, speaking rights in the Dáil are generally based on parties, so the time is divided up. The larger parties get to speak more on the basis of their representation. The Ceann Comhairle has come out in recent months to say that because we have an increasing number of independents who are not members of the technical group, then he will look after their rights as individual members to make a contribution, so they can be accommodated. The sole choice of the next speaker is a matter for the Ceann Comhairle, so he has a very powerful role in the selection of an individual to speak. But you're absolutely right. Normally on bills and on important motions, the first large number of speakers tend to come from the larger parties.
Thank you. Catherine?
Yeah, I act as the whip for the technical group, and I don't. That isn't exactly how it works.
Maybe he's not the greatest living expert.
Thank you. You just said that on live television. Thank you very much. Yeah.
First of all, the way standing orders are defined in relation to an independent is what you are the day you're elected. If you're elected under a party banner, that's what you're deemed to be, even if you separate from a party during the lifetime of the particular Dáil. And those who have ended up being independents since, say they were elected as Labour or Fine Gael and are now independent, they're not entitled, for example, to join the technical group. The technical group is open to, it has to be a minimum of 7 members. And indeed, the way the time rotates, in theory, the Ceann Comhairle can call whoever they decide in the order they decide, but that, in actual fact, that's not the way it works. It is very well organised behind the scenes, so that there is lists that are operated, and essentially, when a piece of legislation comes in first, there's the openers are a defined time that'll come from the government side, and the groups then will have proportional time. In actual fact, the technical group, I think some of the government backbenchers will give out about the like of our group, for example, or the like of Sinn Féin or even Fianna Fáil, in the amount of time that the opposition gets in proportion to, for example, government backbenchers, because of the size of the Dáil. But in actual fact, independents in the technical group would get the same amount of time as the like of Sinn Féin or Fianna Fáil would get. So it's actually it's not disproportionate. So we do get ample time. But the anomaly is people who have become independent since they were elected, or people who don't choose to join the technical group.
Okay. Thanks very much, Catherine, for that very helpful contribution. Katrina.
Just a very brief comment, and I don't want to get too technical, but I think, again, the newer institutions that have been established might be worth looking at, because in the North there's a very fair way of speaking rights for parties, but also for individuals and small groups. So I think it might be worth looking at what happens there, because we try to ensure in any arrangements that are brought in that there's all parties in the interests of power sharing and multi-party, that they get representation. So I would advise that. I would imagine something similar is happening in Scotland as well, so it might be worth looking at that too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Catherine here. Thanks, Mary.
I'd just like to say that at our table here, there was strong agreement that if there is a new committee formed to deal with Dáil reform, that perhaps it should be directed by the convention on a number of issues to look at, starting number 1, 2, 3, 4 down along. Because as someone else said down the hall there, there's so much involved in this, it's absolutely nearly impossible to cover it all in this short weekend. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I do take that the point that Thomas originally made about the breadth of issues that we're dealing with here over a very brief period of time. So it is a definite reality that there are limits to the amount of wisdom we can capture and express. But I think all we can do is do our best. Any other comments? I'm sure there must be, because because we have a few minutes left before Charlie. Yeah. Do you want to talk about the committee?
Thanks, Chair. Charlie Flanagan. I know I was in before, Chairman, but just very briefly, I don't think it's sufficient to actually deal with the electoral system for the Ceann Comhairle, how the Ceann Comhairle is elected. I think the fundamental point is the power of the Ceann Comhairle in terms of initiating debate, sending for reports, calling in chairs of committees, calling people to account, calling government to account. So it's a lot more than just the election. It's what that person does when they are elected, which, in my view, should give rise to a situation where there is need actually to outline some of the basic powers in the Constitution. And second point, on the family-friendly hours, I think we need to exercise care here. I mean, the Constitution says that the Dáil and Shannon should sit in Dublin. The Constitution also says that there should be a matter of constituencies. One of those constituencies is Kerry, Cork, Galway, Mayo. It's just not possible to have family-friendly hours in the manner in which people might necessarily regard as family-friendly hours. The reason the week is compacted into Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday and sitting in the evening is to facilitate people exercise their own constitutional obligation, coming from Kerry, Cork or whatever. So it's a difficult one, and it's not just as simple as saying we need more family-friendly hours, and it's a conundrum, the detail of which we should perhaps have a look at before making any decision on it. Thanks, Chair.
All right. Angus, yeah, and I know you had made some comment about being on a committee, the Committee on Dáil Reform. Maybe you could perhaps reflect on that committee.
I can reflect. Interesting enough, there's 4 whips here, so there's four members of that subcommittee on Dáil Reform present. So if people are looking kind of for information of what changes have happened, because there's quite a substantial changes that have happened since this Dáil came about. So people will be aware of Friday sittings were mentioned. That's a new change. That committee report can be debated in the Dáil chamber on a Friday. Topical issues would be another one. There's quite a range, and some of the topics people have mentioned kind of have been looked at. There's also all of the parties can make a submission to the Dáil Reform Committee, make proposals. Maybe in the future, kind of that committee should take proposals from outside, and that's something that could be looked at. And then it's by agreement that committee then puts forward changes in standing orders. So we have seen it. We've seen kind of extended sitting hours, so it sits at 9:30 in the morning rather than before it was 10:30. Kind of, and as I said, Friday sittings. The private members legislation, which is discussed on a Friday, is also a new initiative. So there's quite a range. We haven't seen the full outworking of all of them. The the one that I'm interested in seeing, especially into the future, is the pre-legislative stage, that there is a commitment kind of that all legislation in future can go once the heads of the bill, that's the outline of the bill has been agreed by the Cabinet, that then the committee can deal with that. And one of the advantages that is, I dealt with one before Christmas, the gender recognition bill, kind of it allowed us to invite in all of the affected groups into committee to discuss it. So that was kind of the committee engaging with the public, and then make a report to the Minister, who should take that into account when drafting the exact wording of that legislation. And I think that will help kind of speed up the process of legislation in the next couple of stages. So there are imaginative proposals. We'll see the outcome. And the Count Corla also has a role in that, because he's the chair of the overall committee that decides standing orders, which the Committee on Procedures of Privilege. And he has also, over the last year, which I hadn't seen in previous styles, made his own suggestions. So for instance, you have the clock in the chamber, kind of that's one of his initiative, and the advantage of that is it cuts out people speaking beyond their time, cuts across people having arguments rather than kind of sticking to the time. So I think maybe at a later stage, maybe for the next convention, just if you got a report from the Dáil Reform Committee just of what changes have happened, I think that might be useful for the members, just so that it's not all black and white.
We have a paper outside on the table.
Yeah, thanks very much for that contribution. There is a paper on the table outside which lists the range of reforms that have been introduced, and it should be circulated. And in fact, that point you talk about the pre-legislative work, I suppose the best known example of that happened last January under Jerry Butterman's chairmanship of the Health Committee, when they were talking about the piece of legislation that eventually became the Protection of Life Bill. So thank you for that, and maybe we'll hear more from Jerry about that later on. Any other comments? Ivana, you were in before, so I'll take you if I can, but John first of all.
John Connolly, Dundrum. We haven't made too many remarks referable to the Senate today, because we're discussing Dáil reform. But naturally enough, one of the big vacant spaces that we have in front of us is the communication and the working relationship between that'll have to be set up virtually anew between the Dáil and the Senate. And it would be nice if the Dáil committee or a select committee was set up with a view to overviewing all of those arrangements that have been made necessary by reason of the people deciding that the Senate was important. Thank you.
Thank you. That connects with the point that I think Murish made earlier on today in his contribution. Did I see, Ivana, there's nobody else offering, so by all means, yeah.
Just to come back briefly
Yeah, sure.
To come back briefly on what Charlie said about family-friendly hours. And, you know, it is true that what family-friendly hours may mean different things in parliaments due to the nature of them. That people may have to be away from home overnight and so on. That's understood. But there is an international report, the Interparliamentary Union, on gender-friendly parliaments that has recommendations about how you can best go about fixing the structures of Parliament so that it is facilitated for particularly for people with young children, with families. And I know myself and anyone with young children that really the key thing is not to have late changes in the schedule, that can make it very difficult for anyone who's trying to arrange caring responsibilities outside. And I should have also credited Jerry Buttermer with the idea for the State of the Union address, which was enthusiastically adopted by our table.
Okay, Jerry. Yeah.
And Jerry Buttermer, and just on that one, it's actually coming in April of this year. As part of the reform programme, and the committee which Angus is involved in has met 10 times since this Dáil came in, and the Taoiseach and the Tánaiste met with all the party leaders in October, and we've had 3 Dáil debates in reform in this Dáil, and as a consequence of this report from this convention, there will be another report with another debate on Dáil reform, and I'll keep my remarks to the other issue in a minute, but yeah. I think the important point, part of where we fail, I think, is that we don't communicate what's happening within Leinster House. And some of the stuff that happens within the Dáil may not be of interest to people outside, i.e. the structures or the hours or whatever. But I think the biggest thing I see from being a chair and being a backbencher is that perhaps communication with the general public needs to be improved. And we have a very good communication system in the Oireachtas, and we have social media, but I think a lot of it gets lost in the translation and transmission. But I think it would be important that we would look at the whole issue of the Oireachtas in terms of the Shannon as well, in light of the referendum. I know it's not part of our remit this weekend, but I think it maybe as part of our AOB, we might maybe tack something on for the March meeting, maybe.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Yeah, Thomas again.
Just in relation to the document we've been handed out, I had the chance to read it beforehand because I took it up myself. I would consider this a political document, I have to say, and I'm not going to go into it line by line now, but I wouldn't consider this an impartial description of the reforms that have gone on in the Oireachtas, and it's written by a politician.
Okay, thank you. Tom.
Tom Burke. Jerry referred to 3 reports. Obviously, they're in the Dáil debate somewhere. But I wonder, you know, given that the subject of the meeting is Dáil reform, would it be possible to have the references emailed to us so we could look them up ourselves before the next meeting? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good practical idea. It will also perhaps influence, you know, when we start writing the report of this meeting, it at least they probably need to be acknowledged. So people will be aware of them when they're reviewing the draft. Catherine, please. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry to come in again. I just wanted to make a point on the pre-legislative, of the importance of the pre-legislative stage, which is obviously a new development. I'm on the Environment, Local Government, Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht Committee, which used to also have the remit for transport, tourism and sport, which you can see how impossible that kind of an agenda is to adequately give scrutiny that's needed. But during the summer we did nearly a full week of hearings on the climate change legislation. It was incredibly useful. I don't think there was a line about it in any media outlet, but it was incredibly useful because essentially we were hearing from people like, for example, the Farmers Association or transport providers or people who are, you know, interested in, you know, who are organised in groups around climate change, and it was right across the spectrum, really useful. We then did a report. Now, what we want our legislation to be is we had the engagement with the groups before the legislation really formed, and some of the ideas were picked up by the Minister and will form part of the legislation when we see it later on in the year. That's the kind of thing we need the resources for. And there was a conflict there in that there was one government, there was legislation proposed by one government that said one thing, and then the new government said the very opposite. And we were looking for the legal advice that informed both of those because they were in conflict with each other and we couldn't see it. So that's the kind of thing that it becomes a difficulty when you've then got to get separate legal advice in and you don't know if what you're proposing is actually going to be possible to implement. But it's a really useful initiative, but it is going to require resources and it is going to require more time at committee. And, you know, this notion that you have to be, the Dáil chamber is empty, you know, the presentation of that gives the impression that you're doing nothing. And I think that also is going to, you know, the committee week, for example, would be incredibly important in there being an you know, exclusive focus on the work of the committees. And I think that might change the perception of what goes on. But the resources may well be kind of resources for the committee rather than for, you know, for individual groupings, if you like.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, you do have, and it's been commented on earlier, that the work, sometimes the very valuable work of committees, gets very little attention in the public arena. And I mean, how to change that, I don't know. Maybe the media have a role and a responsibility, or maybe, as Jerry says, it's a matter of telling the story better. But there's a dilemma here, I think. Robert, please.
Well, one of the reasons I think that the committees don't get so much scrutiny is because there's less argy-bargy at them. So it's carefully going through reports or whatever, and it's not very exciting for the media, and generally there is less inter-party flack, for want of a better word, at committee meetings. So, and I mean, from my experience, I mean, the media seems primarily interested in a conflict situation. So, if things are being discussed in a rational way, it isn't very good TV or press. So that's a problem. But I do think, in relation to when we start doing the heads of bill, I think there will be much greater pressure on committees, and the idea of a committee week is probably a good one. And whether that'll be sufficient, it will depend really on how it works out. But it's certainly a welcome development, because I think it allows more scope for both interest groups and backbench TDs to have an input. So,
okay, thank you. Okay, we've time for one or two more comments if they're available. I don't want to drag people. Okay, John, please.
John Lardner. Just short, I suppose. Committees, if the committees had stronger powers of oversight to hold ministers and decision makers, be they senior civil servants, accountable, I think that's what's needed, committees with stronger powers. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. Derek, is it? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Derek Keating. Just a couple of things. Reference was made, I think it was by your good self, Chair, to the Dáil being empty, or somebody referred to it just a moment ago. And it's often alluded to in the press, and Robert made reference to the media's coverage of events. And I often say to people, you know, which is the easier to do? To be in your office, monitoring through the monitor system what's going on, addressing issues, preparing for other Dáil debates or so on, or to sit in the chair all day. So what TDs have, and I speak for myself and I'm sure I speak for others, have been doing over the years is effectively multitasking. In engaging in different things at the same time. That's important. And the other thing is that, and it's often not covered, Angus alluded to it very briefly, is topical issues. And I was glad to see reference to it in the document that we just saw a sight of. And I mean, we've all benefited from that. And the communities that we represent benefit from that in some way. It can lead to steps being taken. Just in the last few days alone, I had a topical issue, and as a result of which the Minister agreed to come out to meet the principals from a school. Now, all TDs at some stage or other have benefited from that. You don't see that covered very often. And the third and final point I make is this. Sometimes reference is made in the media to a TD endeavouring to hold on to his seat, or a TD endeavouring to hold on to her seat. And I often say to people, you know, it isn't my seat, or it isn't the TD's seat. It is the people's seat. I happen to be privileged to be elected to represent them in that seat for the duration of the 31st Dáil. And I, as a member, have that opportunity to invite people into Dáil Éireann. Many people take that up. Many people don't know about it. But what I can say to you is that in all circumstances where I, and I'm sure others, have had visitors into Dáil Éireann and engaging and seeing what happens in the Senate and in the Dáil, and on a guided tour from an educational and historical perspective, each and every one of those students, groups and individuals have gone home with a completely different perspective on what happens in Leinster House. And I would offer that to everybody today here. It is your Dáil, it is your Leinster House. You have the opportunity of having more ownership of it, and you know, being there is often very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Francis. Well, I saw Francis first and then John. Could we have a microphone to Francis?
I mean, I do think the topic today, that it's really important that we're teasing it out like this. And I think equally, I would say again, I think it's important not to over-stereotype how things actually happen. And to really, I think a lot of this is about information and communication as well. And clearly there are structural issues that we know that should be taken on board, which we're discussing today, whether it's about the Count Corla or enhanced powers for the committee. But just to say that, say as a minister, in terms of accountability, it's really important to recognise what's going on at present. So that, for example, I would go before a Dáil committee 4 times quarterly reports of what's being done. The civil service that we've mentioned a little bit about them here today. But those appearances are taken very seriously. It's a huge amount of work put into the preparation. You get questions beforehand which have to be answered in detail, and then they can be orally asked again at the committee. And then the topical issues, which is a new initiative, where if any topic comes up in the general public, that you can be brought into the Dáil on the day if a number of backbenchers or anybody else asks for that, plus the oral questions, which are in the Dáil as well. So again, I mean, these have been there for a long time, some of them, but there are new initiatives as well. And I think the culture, our first speaker today, our second speaker I think it was, talked about cultural change. And I think it is interesting to ask, has there been cultural change in the Dáil? And the first speaker said, he gave the 1922 quote, and then he said, in fairness, there has been. And it might be interesting to talk a little bit about that cultural change. And I would say it's in the growing strength of the committees, and we can go further. I think it's behind the scenes as well in political parties. I mean, we had an interesting discussion at our table, for example, about parliamentary party meetings and what happens at those, and the kind of democracy building that needs to go on within parties as well. So I think that these elements need to be considered as well.
And I think some of those aspects, Meg dealt with them very well this morning. John, perhaps, and then perhaps, John, on this one you have the last word.
Thanks, Tom. John Lyons. I suppose I'm just thinking here after the comments that Derek made, and I know hindsight is a great gift and it comes too late, unfortunately. But I think in order to inform this debate today, wouldn't it have been great if we ensured every single member of the Constitutional Convention that kind of a really in-depth guide of Leinster House was offered in advance to kind of take them through the walk, not just the ordinary tour that members get to go on when they come in to see, but to kind of give them as near as possible as you can to kind of what goes on in Leinster House, because unfortunately, we've had a lot of things even today that have come up through no fault of anybody's that have come up on the screen, and then a lot of us as TDs here today, have been kind of saying, no, that's not correct. And then we're relying on people then to actually make recommendations and vote on things tomorrow, when there's been a little bit of looseness at times through no fault of anybody's. But I really think, in hindsight, wouldn't it have been great to give every single person who's on the convention a really kind of in-depth, behind-the-scenes guide to all the ins and outs of Leinster House, and then, come back and have this discussion. But we can't do that now at this stage. So, thanks.
Well, actually, I think you're entirely right. It actually would have been a very good idea, but I think maybe we should take that idea and say that, even following this meeting, we should extend that invitation to all the members of the convention and arrange. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. I think, as was said here, or as Francis said, I think teasing this issue out in the level of detail that we've been doing is important, because we are ultimately going to have to frame a series of questions overnight, which you will be voting on tomorrow. And the more, I think, the more we're clear about, what is happening, what has happened, the better. So hopefully, I think this has been a useful session. We're now going to be, our friends from the, let's call them the AWAPA group, are going to leave us. I do want to acknowledge that while they were out of the room earlier today, they had the opportunity of speaking with very distinguished Judge Maureen Harding-Clark and Professor Jerry White, who we had met here at the convention at an earlier stage. And so I hope this morning overall, both attending the convention and with those sessions, have been of great value. I also want to say that this morning, when I mentioned the Tunisian constitution being written, because I just received a copy of it, what I had omitted to say, of course, was that the Egyptian constitution has also been written in the last period of time, and Egypt is going through a very challenging time at the moment. But I suppose central to the direction of Egypt and its future is the fact that they have a constitution. So we wish them well also in the process. So we'll be seeing our friends later on this evening at dinner. So they're leaving us now, but we very much look forward to seeing you later on. Thank you very much.
Mary C. Murphy up and the other members of the panel.